thanks very much, Scott and Simon, for some, I think, very clearly laying out the biological principles and the neurological principles of diversity. I want to maybe, and I agree with, I think, everything they said about the theory, which I see playing out in practice. So let me maybe give some quick insights into how I see these things playing out in practice. So first of all, the resilience or the dynamic problem solving that both Scott and Simon talked about, I'd say is increasingly important. So here what you see is the competitive spread, the difference in shareholder returns of companies over time, the difference between the best and the worst, or the top and the bottom quartile. And what we see is that over the last 50 years, that spread has increased. And that's because essentially we're dealing with dynamic problems, not static optimization problems in business strategy. And furthermore, in periods of volatility, such as the COVID crisis, the Ukraine crisis, we see the competitive spread increase by between 50 and 100%. So it's particularly important during crises, and it's more important over time, which is why business essentially is in search of a dynamic theory of strategy or complex problem solving. The principles that Simon laid out in his Fragile Dominion book, we would very much see as being a characteristic of the companies that do well on dynamic problem solving over time. Prudence, redundancy, diversity, modularity, adaptiveness. We'd add embeddedness, namely the alignment between the social systems in which companies are embedded and their strategic and business systems is very important over long periods of time. And so we find it actually possible to operationalize these principles. So these principles break down into a set of practices that resilient companies employ consistently, and non-resilient companies deploy less. And roughly speaking, when we look at the most resilient companies, whether you look at the 2008 financial crisis or the COVID crisis, the most resilient companies are employing about 2/3 of these practices. So one of the problems we have with resilience is the slipperiness of the definition and the ability to measure it. And I think we can measure it by looking at performance outcomes over time. Essentially, within any industry sector, there's a spread of performance before, during, and after disturbances, and we can measure the area between the two curves. So we can measure resilience and the repeatability of resilience across time. And one of the interesting things that emerges across that analysis, if you then cross that with the principles that Simon talked about, is that we believe that resilience in practice in business plays out on different timescales. So we have to think about the problem of anticipation or preparedness. We have to think about the problem of absorption in a shock environment, the immediate impact, which can be fatal in some cases. Bankruptcies tick up during periods of crisis in business. We have to think about the ability to adapt to changing circumstances. And importantly, the word resilience and robustness sort of imply some sort of avoidance of downside risk. But I think we also have to have this sort of the upside possibility of flourishing in changed circumstances. So our definition of resilience is essentially flourishing flourishing under change on these 4 timescales. If we're looking at human systems, I think we must add one more principle to Simon's biological principles, which is we must add intentionality and the capacity for imagination. So I think critically, the ability to flourish under new circumstances depends upon all of those issues of redundancy and modularity and diversity that Simon talked about and Scott talked about, but also the ability to reimagine, to indulge in counterfactual thinking, to imagine futures which could exist and don't yet exist. And I'll show you a splendid example of that. So here is a chart from the Walt Disney Organization that, apart from its faded color of the paper, you may think that this is actually a map of Walt Disney's or the Disney Incorporated's actual current business model, because it's fairly close to the set of things that they do and the interrelationships between them. In fact, it was, this is about 30 years old. This is this is the imagined map of Disney before it actually existed. So I think the capacity for collective imagination, as well as the capacity for problem solving with real world problems, is an important part of this. We would all agree that in practice, diversity predicts growth. So we have a measure we call vitality, which is the predictive of future growth. One of the problems with business metrics is that they're mostly backward looking. They mostly predict what happened as opposed to what will happen. We have a back-tested model which is contains 18 factors, and we've now been running with it for about 10 years, and it's not perfect, but it's better than any financial indicators or market indicators of predicting future growth. And so it's interesting to look at whether diversity, people diversity, is one of those factors, and it turns out to be. So diversity is important. The problem here is that we, across a large sample, this is all public companies, but for a large sample of companies, we can't actually measure all of the dimensions of diversity outside in, but for the ones we can measure, such as gender and racial diversity in senior levels in the company, then it indeed is predictive of growth. Last point I want to make is maybe touching on some of the issues that Scott raised on cognitive diversity. So I believe that the diversity is differentially effective in different environments. So I think that strategy is not one thing. According to the unpredictability of the environment, which varies between industries and over time, the malleability of those environments, can we actually shape those environments, and the harshness of those environments. Actually, effective strategy consists of very different cognitive operations. So for example, classical strategy in predictable environments is essentially a planning problem. That is a very specific type of problem. Adapting to an unknowable or unpredictable environment, such as a nascent industry, is a totally different type of problem. That's more one of adaptation. Creating something entirely new in the world is more like an exercise in imagination. It's a visionary problem. It's a creative problem. So one of the things we did with Simon is to create what we call a universal strategy simulator, which is actually a population of multi-armed bandits, which is able to simulate all of these different strategic environments. And we asked the question, what sort of skills are applicable in each of these environments? So we have a game, and we have a large population of game playing data to measure who's good at these different strategic environments. And then my last slide, we then teamed up with a company called Pymetrics that measures, so there are about 90 well-documented neuroscience traits that are also diagnosable through games. And we combined that with the strategy gameplay data, and we asked the question, what are the skills of effective strategists? And what we found was that the skills that you require, the neuroscience skills that you require, which are the rows on this chart, were actually different according to the strategic environment. The second thing we found was that there were very few, only about 1% of universally gifted strategists, that different people had different collections of skills. And therefore, actually, it's more or less a statistical necessity, unless you're extremely good at recruiting and figuring out the environments that you'll face, which is, of course, nearly impossible. Then you need a cognitively diverse team across a population of environments. And any large company is usually seeing all of these environments simultaneously in different parts of the business. So bottom line, I think resilience is increasingly important. I think it's measurable. I think it very much depends upon the sort of traits that Simon and Scott talked about. Diversity is a key one. And I think we begin to see the connection between the skills that you need in particular strategic environments and the neuroscience traits that you can actually recruit for and select for to make sure that you have the right sort of cognitively diverse teams.